coffee, big cup, and hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. I'm Laura.
And I'm Kate. And this week, we're continuing our discussion about Lorelai by doing a sort of quote-unquote mock therapy exercise for her. Since the inception of this podcast, starting back at the beginning of 2022, months before we even started recording anything, I've been making notes for each topic we've come up with. And when I started the document for Lorelai, of course, the first thing I started writing about was how much she's defined by her independence. And, later I came across the term hyper-independence. And of course, I was like, ding, 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 that is Lorelai to a T. And recently, as I've been prepping more specifically for these episodes, I came across a BuzzFeed article that was cribbed from HuffPost about this topic that had a few steps suggested by a therapist to manage this more toxic form of independence. And I thought, hey, that could be a fun way to structure this episode because Lord knows Lorelai needs therapy. I swear to God, Lorelai Gilmore is straight out of a university psychology textbook.
That's where Amy got her inspiration. We finally figured it out.
Yeah. Ironic for someone who didn't go to college and didn't take Psych 101.
Yeah. Now, of course, we are not licensed therapists, and nothing we say here should be considered advice or psychotherapy. We just thought the structure of this article presented a convenient lens through which to analyze this particular trait of Lorelai's, and we're hoping to have a balanced and empathetic discussion about this and do our best to provide a little edutainment in the process. Just also a friendly reminder that hyperindependence is not a mental health diagnosis, but rather a cluster of behaviors that is usually indicative of some kind of underlying trauma or compensatory mechanism developed by people who had attachment issues, especially in childhood. It's pretty common, and a little bit of self-awareness, thoughtful engagement, and openness, I think, really goes a long way in recognizing some of our less helpful habits and figuring out where those habits might be helping us, but also where they might be hurting us. So that's going to be sort of the focus of this week's episode. But before we really dive into it, this is also your friendly reminder to please do all those YouTube-y things for us. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, share it with your GG friends, anyone who you think might want some fresh content. We really always appreciate all of that support.
Yeah, and if you hear a cat, she has a cat. I could already hear his little bell tinkling earlier before recording, so you might get to hear him too. So let's kick this off with, I guess, just a basic discussion of independence, find it helpful to define terms before we start talking about them. So, independence is really sort of like not relying on others to fulfill your needs or provide your necessities of life, basically. And as a society, especially here in North America and the West, we've decided that in order to survive in the world, one needs to be independent. It's this sort of ideal that we cling to. Dependency is seen as a dirty word. It somehow indicates a deficiency or a weakness in a person. And so I think we've run with this idea of independence as being something that is good in and of itself and an end to which we should aspire. So that's a good thing. I think it's pretty well universally accepted that independence is a good thing because too much dependence on other people can lead to unhealthy behaviors, unhealthy reliance on others. And then if something were to happen to that relationship through any number of means, whether it's like a breakup or someone passing away or someone leaving, moving, any of those kinds of things can cause great psychological harm when someone who was responsible for fulfilling so many of your needs, whether those be psychological, emotional, physical, financial, when that goes away, then suddenly you're left insecure, and that's not good. It's really bad. And so, independence is really something that we strive for, especially as women. I think that there's definitely an aspect of this that has permeated through feminist discourse, obviously. Susan B. Anthony apparently once said, independence is happiness. And there is truth in that sentiment, I think, but I also want to put that in context in that she was a suffragette. This was coming from a time when women couldn't vote and couldn't independently own land. And it took several decades more for women to fully have all of the same rights and freedoms as men did. And so I think, on its face, that quote is accurate, but it doesn't go far enough when it comes to assessing why independence is important and why maybe going too far in the other direction is just as dangerous as not having any independence.
Yeah, and obviously the context behind what she said is, as you alluded to, the push for women's rights, in the 18th and 19th century, as, they were trying to obtain just, the permission to do all of those things. But to counter it, it's also reliance can also just be very harmful as well. And it's something that we're going to talk about in terms of trying to find and strike the balance, between those two things and how our characters do it well, how they don't. Independence is a really wonderful thing, and it can lead to a lot of happiness, but too much reliance can also be very negative. So there's good in both here. You want to be independent, but you also want to feel like you can ask for help when you need it, that you can have people in your life that you are going to rely on, so that you're finding a healthy mix between both. And so, again, I love her quote there, but the context behind it was just because she was striving for equality. And we need to remember that just within any sort of healthy relationship here, it's about finding that independence, but also finding that when you, and if you can rely on people, that you should. And that's also a very acceptable and okay thing as well.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, independence is a good thing because, it allows us to have self-esteem and self-efficacy. It allows us to develop skills for survival, whether it's, of the homesteading variety or the ability to make money for ourselves and manage that appropriately. It allows us to control our own fate. And again, that's kind of what the suffragettes were fighting for. It was women's ability to control their own fates. And I think that's a big part of what Lorelai wants as well, after a childhood full of control and manipulation and belittlement. And yeah, so independence is essentially us asserting ourselves in the world as separate beings with our own values and experiences and beliefs and personalities that, that are wholly our own. And that's why we don't want to go to either end. Like many things, independence exists on a spectrum. You can have sort of like codependent enmeshment on the one side and hyper counterdependency on the other side. And, there is a sweet spot in the middle that Lorelai maybe has gone to, like, closer to the hyper independent side. There's a balance that she lacks, I think, in this. And the other thing I think about that is that she kind of darts around on that a little bit, depending on who she's with. And I think that's totally,
exactly.
Yeah, that's normal. You can have a healthy interdependence with one person and an unhealthy codependency with another person. It really depends on a lot of different factors. I think we see more codependency with Rory and more hyper independence around other people like Emily, right? It depends on who she feels safe with, how she behaves and engages in those moments. And so we're here today mostly to talk about her on that, like, far left side of the spectrum, where she exists in this place that is so walled off from intimacy and trust because of the experiences that come out of her childhood. So someday in the future, we'll get to the whole Lorelai and Rory having no boundaries thing with that codependency. But today, it's going to be a little bit more the other end of the spectrum, literally. So let's go there, I guess. I guess let's talk about sort of like the sense of self and the sense of identity when it comes to independence. I think there's a lack of sense of self and a lack of trusting yourself, trusting that your needs will be respected and understood, and that you'll be seen for who you are and not judged for expressing vulnerability, right? And I think Lorelai has really internalized this view of herself. There's this story she tells about herself to herself over and over again, and it's reflected back to her from other people as well, that like she is Superwoman. She can do it all. I got by without any help from anyone. What do you
I mean, we've talked about how that's definitely not true as well, but I feel like that sense of self just starts from probably early on in her childhood, and we've talked about how we wish we would have seen more of it. We don't get it, but I feel like she is constantly building herself up as, you know, someone in middle school, as a teenager, as someone going into her 20s, as she's working her way up the ladder, you know, in terms of going from becoming, you know, a maid to a manager of this establishment. But I feel like she was probably very much hard on herself in a way that I think is common for a lot of people to be. You know, we're our own worst critic. No one is going to ever, you know, harp on you probably more than your own self. So I feel like this was her way of trying to constantly just build herself up and to say, I did this. I raised this kid on my own. I worked up this corporate ladder to, you know, obtain the position that I have now. And I did that. So I should be allowed to feel and be proud of myself and not have to have any sort of self-hate or self-loathing or any sort of negative view of my persona. And I think it was even more vital for Lorelai to continue to tell herself that when she probably had 18 years up until she, you know, left home, of Emily and Richard probably even inadvertently spoon feeding her this idea that she was not living up to expectations and that she was not doing enough. So of course, when any kid is feeling that, I can see how she left home just feeling diminished and maybe having a little bit of that going on. So now she's just had to spend the better part of the last decade plus since she has left home countering that and just telling herself that she is worthy of, you know, what she has accomplished at this point in time. But I think it's also very much tying into why she knee jerks as soon as she leaves home into an overdrive of hyper independence, because she needs to not be reliant on people like Emily and Richard, including them as well. She just needs to feel like she can do this for herself because that's what's going to boost her self-esteem.
Exactly. Like I said, she's sort of organized her life around this idea that independence is the number one thing that is important to her and important to other people as well. You know, it's sort of like part of her identity to be on her own and to do things by herself. She holds it as part of what makes her special and worthy. And everybody else seems to concur with that assessment, especially Christopher. My God, like just the number of times he refers to her as Superwoman or Supermom, like, yowza. And so it sort of sets this really high bar for her to put pressure on herself to constantly attain that. And it leads her to sort of like put so much focus on doing things by herself that the expectations aren't reasonable for that. Because like anyone, Lorelai has needs and she cannot meet them alone. She needs to be able to rely on other people, but she has a hard time trusting them because when she was younger, she didn't have anyone she could trust. Her parents were not safe for her. The way that they showed their love didn't make her feel loved, and therefore she couldn't be vulnerable with them. And so that eventually manifested in her saying, or like subconsciously saying, I don't know if she even recognizes this pattern in herself necessarily the way that we can see it as the audience, but it's like, I have to choose my own needs over everything else, over you, over everyone except maybe Rory, because that's what I have to do, or what I think I have to do to stay safe and secure. Like there's this psychological safety that she needs that requires her to not be around, especially Emily. Like I was watching The Fundamental Things Apply earlier when she finds out that Natalie has worked with her mother in the past, and she tells Suki, like, my whole life, my whole existence, my being, my ability to be this sparkling creature standing here before you, all of this depends on the complete and total separation of my life from my mother's. And she's carried that through all of these other relationships where it's just like, I have to be so cut off. I have to carve out this massive boundary around myself and put up this wall because it's the only way to keep control of my own life.
Yeah. And it's interesting that I think, Rory is the catalyst for like being the one person that she is not going to instill that hyper independence with. And I think it's obviously because Rory is, a baby who is going to need, that round the clock care growing up. But I think she latched onto Rory in that way, and they became so codependent to one another because that was the only person that she was going to feel safe with at the end of the day and that she could trust. Even, her closest friend, Suki, I don't think we ever get it. Even with Luke, the man that she gets into a relationship and ends up marrying, I still don't think it's ever there, or it will ever be there in the same way as what she has with Rory. And again, we'll save the codependency talk for when we dive deeper into the two of them, and especially when we get into Rory's episodes. But I also find it so telling that she just never even allowed herself to open up with some of the closest people in her life, like your husband and your best friend. You can't even do that with them. It really speaks volumes as to maybe the trauma that she experienced as a young person and the damage that Emily and Richard did to her. Because I think a lot of this hyper independency is a result of trauma like that.
Exactly. I think she thinks that she's the only one capable, like truly capable of taking care of herself. And because of that, she tends to attract people who reflect that back to her. And Luke is one of those people, like mentioning him. Yeah. We're going to talk about her and Luke in a little more detail, but sort of on this particular topic, it's one of those things where I'm like, does this make him good for her? Because, we know he has a generous spirit. He wants to take care of her. He does so much for her and asks so little. And she could trust him to be around. It has taken years for her to develop this trust with him, where she has seen via his repeated positive behaviors toward her that he's not going anywhere. And so in a way that makes her feel safe with him. And I think that's part of the reason that she chooses him. But in a way, I think that also makes them bad for each other because he is kind of the same. He's also quite, I don't know if I would describe him as hyper independent, but he's very much, this also might be sort of like a masculine socialization thing as opposed to a childhood trauma thing. Just that sort of like rugged, manly, I can take care of myself, I don't have emotions kind of mentality that a lot of guys like Luke have. But like, you can see that they both have this sort of like very independent streak. And this is what causes a lot of their conflict because they never truly like meld. They coexist peacefully and they have fun together and they trust each other and they respect each other and whatnot. But they both have such massive boundaries around certain areas of their life and they compartmentalize things in a counterproductive way. And we'll get into that when we talk about April, especially. But, when you have these, like, in a way, it's good for them because they allow each other to maintain that independence that both of them feel like so psychologically driven to achieve and to maintain. Neither of them really like pushes the other to let go of that death grip on their independent lives. And like, obviously in every relationship, you need some level of independence, but there's a healthy level of interdependence that is totally possible to achieve when you're openly communicating and constantly renegotiating your boundaries. And it feels like they're not doing that. It just feels like they're butting heads all the time because they're both so unwilling to meet in the middle and to compromise and do all of that. I feel like I don't want to go too much more into this topic right now, but we'll probably come back to this as well once we actually get into the meat of the article and how hyperindependence has impacted Lorelai. But you mentioned Luke, and I had to say it because but yeah, let's back up a little bit and maybe talk about Lorelai's early years and maybe how this kind of started to develop. And I think it's interesting to note, and this comes as no surprise to anyone, that Lorelai's physical needs were taken care of. She comes from a privileged background. She had a nice house. She never wanted for anything. She had maids and cleaners and caretakers, probably nannies. I wonder how many nannies were fired by Emily before finding one she liked, if ever. And despite having sort of like a stay-at-home mom, I don't know how involved Emily was in the emotional development of her daughter. And so, many kids who experience trauma come from the other side of that, where they experience lack and their parents are not around because they're always working. And that's how they end up having to take care of themselves and often siblings as well, while their parents economically provide for the family. And so they're never really sure if their parent is going to be there for them when they need it. And so that's how they sort of develop that I can do everything myself mentality. With Lorelai, it's clear that she felt emotionally unsafe. It was not okay to be herself or to express herself as a child. And I think that's in many ways just as harmful as not having all of your physical safety needs met, even though they're sort of like lower on Maslow's hierarchy. Maybe it's, I don't know if it's more damaging to not have those like higher needs met. Like, when you're not worried about your physical safety, you automatically like climb to the next rung of that hierarchy. And so it feels just as disturbing to not trust your caretakers and to constantly receive negative feedback and criticism from them. So, some people develop this sort of hyper independence streak because they don't want to be a burden to other people, because maybe they felt like that when they were younger, or they had examples from their parents or other adults in their lives where other people wouldn't ask for help because of that, or they say like, oh, like don't be a burden, don't ask too much, don't expect too much, you're the only one who can take care of you. Like there are some people who have that as sort of their background for this. But with Lorelai, it feels much more like I'm going to do everything I can to never be controlled again.
Yeah. But I think like also we can both agree that Emily and Richard were physically there and they were present, but that doesn't mean that they were good and active parents, even though they were in the household. I could foresee, a 10-year-old Lorelai needing help with homework, and asking Emily, and Emily's just like, isn't there a maid that can don't we have someone on staff that can assist her with this? Like I have a phone call in 10 minutes. I have a DAR meeting. I can't be doing this right now. Emily and Richard, probably not the type of parents that were like, tucking their child into bed every single night and reading bedtime stories. Don't we have someone that we pay to do this for us? So they were there, but they were not there. And that was probably really detrimental to Lorelai. And it just made me think of like, this is just a whole different can of worms that, we could speculate on. And I don't want us to necessarily go here, but it's a really an saddening thing for me to think, is this one of the reasons why potentially Lorelai became so sexually active at an incredibly early age? Because we don't know what, that time frame was, but it seems like from the time that she was even perhaps like 12 or 13, she was already, having sex. And is it because that there was this emotional void within the household that your parents weren't filling? Maybe you didn't have a lot of friends at school, and this was your way of trying to have that need met. But that's just really sad for me to even think about, that this much trauma was now forcing her into that direction, and to start having these experiences where, in my mind, I'm not here to like judge, but I think that's that's way too young to be doing something like that. And it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, I think this would be a good time to also introduce the concept of counterdependency. This was a more recent one that I learned about after being like, oh, hyper independent. Yeah. But counterdependency takes it like to the next level. I think this is truly like the far left end of the spectrum. Counterdependency is the state of refusal of attachment, the denial of personal need and dependency, and may extend to the omnipotence and refusal of dialogue found in destructive narcissism. To be clear, I don't think Lorelai is a narcissist. I think this is just something that tends to present itself more often in narcissistic personality types. But basically, the theory about this is that it comes out of two different phases in our lives. So the first one is around the age of 2, where toddlers start to try to separate themselves from their mother and assert their independence by saying no. This is why we get the terrible twos, right? Like, this is why it's such a fraught time for little kids. It's because they're finally starting to realize their own agency and test those boundaries a little bit. And so when the parent, especially the mom, has trouble accepting the child's need for that active distancing, the child can remain stuck in that counter-dependent phase because of that lack of freedom. Like, they're rebelling against their mom trying to hold on too tight, basically. And the next stage where this happens again is in the adolescent and teenage years, where once again you have kids who are starting to approach adulthood and who are really starting to develop their own identities as people, and they need to be able to separate themselves from their parents even further. And so this is why you get so many, again, rebellious teens who are cold and distant with their parents, and remaining in that phase and like staying stuck there because your parents are so imposing and oppressive on you, can lead to mechanical counterdependence, basically like that automatic, like you're not even thinking about it. It's not like you're actively trying to just be like, nah, it's like this, I have to do this because it's the only way to stay separate. It's the only way to assert my individuality. And that's where Lorelai got stuck, literally. So not only did this sort of stage of development last, but she was frozen there because of the additional trauma of having a child at 16. And so it's absolutely about what you said, where like that individuality that she was trying to express as a teen manifested itself as dating, it's sexual activity. That's how she was, or like one of the only ways that she was able to exercise any of her own autonomy as a person and as a woman. And it came out in that way where she was just like, I'm going to do exactly the opposite of what they want me to do. I'm not going to be that good little girl. I'm going to resist this at every turn. And so that's how we got here. But yeah, I thought the counterdependency definition was so important here. And it definitely leads people to push people away, to avoid contact and to avoid conflict, which can lead to a lot of isolation. And I think we see that in Lorelai, although we don't see it so much as we know about it, I guess, because when the show starts, obviously she gets with Max, and that's the start of her real journey towards her big love, her romance, because she put that on the back burner when Rory was young, which also just makes me think of like the idea that sacrifice is noble. You know, I think that that's a big part of Lorelai's identity as well, is just like when it comes to hyper independence for, you know, regular single people without kids, it sort of like self obliterates others. But codependency is others obliterate self. And so she's like that with Rory, where it's just like, when it comes to Rory, my needs take a backseat. What I want and need, it like doesn't even hold a candle to the fact that like Rory needs all of my attention right now. And so when Rory is old enough to understand and is, approaching moving out and being her own independent, autonomous adult, that's finally when Lorelai can return to this sort of natural inclination that she has for self over other, like, or self obliterates other, where she can start asserting her own needs again. And that's why we see her kind of steamrolling most of the people that she's with.
Yeah. It's interesting too, though, how it passes along from mother to daughter with Emily and Lorelai, but then Lorelai and Rory as well, because Emily was always very much the person, and I can even hear it in like Kelly Bishop's voice in my mind, like, Lorelai, do what I say. Just do what I say. I feel like if we had $1 for every time that we probably heard Lorelai be on the receiving end of that amongst her childhood, we wouldn't have to go to work anymore. So that was why Lorelai just constantly, fought against what her parents wanted for her, because it was always just do what I say, don't ask questions. There's no room for any give and take here, or for your individuality or your autonomy. It's just going to be whatever we want it to be. So of course she's going to knee-jerk hard in the other reaction, like in the other direction. But we also see Lorelai do it to Rory as well. And one very prominent thing that comes to mind from season 1 is when she is wanting to remain at Stars Hollow High, not go to Chilton, to better herself, obtain a more, consistent and higher level education that could, get her into these Ivy League institutions. And we've talked about it, how Lorelai pulled the mom card there, but I think it was also very much just not an Emily moment, in the same sort of negative context, but she goes in and she says, like, listen, you are going to do what I say. And Monday morning, you will be at Chilton, whether you like it or not. Like, not having the context in that moment to really realize that, boys were also factoring into Rory's decision there. But she was starting to do some of those same things to Rory that Emily had done to her. And thankfully they had a good enough relationship where that was, able to be repaired. And it was coming from not as much of a negative space as what Emily had been doing to Lorelai, but there are very similar behavioral patterns that Lorelai was always passing on to Rory as well. And I think it's just stemming from what Emily had done to her, and the apple wasn't falling as far from the tree as she might have thought that it was.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that theme a little bit next week too when we talk about Lorelai's hypocrisy, because I think we all know where she got it. But yeah, all of that is definitely true. And we'll also probably address the whole Lorelai and Rory and how Rory kind of fits into these patterns in several ways as well, and shares that codependent tendency with Lorelai and hyper independence with others. But I guess that's like a good transition point for us to move into the article that inspired this whole thing to begin with. Obviously, I already kind of like had some some pretty extensive notes on the theme of Lorelai's independence and how defining it was of her character. But then I just kind of stumbled across this article on Instagram and I was like, this might be like some interesting research fodder. And it was, in fact. So the article is called "Therapists Say These Are the Red Flags That You're Actually Too Independent" by Emily Lawrence. And so, she starts off by acknowledging that there's no shortage of bangers that celebrate being independent, like Destiny Child's Independent Woman, Bon Jovi's It's My Life, Kelly Clarkson's Miss Independent. So you can see the theme even cropping up in music and other areas of pop culture as well. So Lorelai is certainly not the only one who holds this as an ideal. There's no question that American culture sees independence as a virtue. Doing something on your own without asking for help is praised. But when taken to the extreme, independence can get in the way of maintaining healthy relationships and also cause a lot of anxiety. Hyper-independence is an extreme form of self-reliance and actively avoiding relying on others for help. So, let's get into some of these points. She notes that like hyper-independence is over-relying on yourself and under-relying on others. It's also known as toxic independence. Points out that independence is a spectrum. Already covered that. An extreme form of self-reliance to the point of isolating yourself from your support network and refusing help even when it's much needed. Yeah. And obviously they point out that a lot of this goes back to, in your childhood, requiring or figuring out that it may have been required or beneficial for you to figure out everything on your own. And that these patterns continue into adulthood and can come into other kinds of relationships, not just how you perceive your parents and your caretakers, but also it becomes this sort of like subconscious pattern when dealing with any relationship, which is where we start to go wrong and where this starts to get really, really bad. I like this quote here. In romantic relationships, the goal is to be a team. Hyper-independence makes that very hard because it's the idea that you can do everything on your own and you don't need the other person. People who are hyper-independent tend to have an avoidant attachment style, meaning they do not believe they need emotional intimacy. All I'm hearing right now in my head is Lorelai sitting on a bench talking to Luke, crying, being like, I always fancied myself Wonder Woman. And, I like my life. I like my stuff. I like my house. But sometimes it would be nice, I think it would be nice to have a partner. And so, I think of incredible thinking Lorelai's when I think of this. But yeah, obviously humans are social creatures. We need other people, whether we like to believe we do or not. We need that. And so let's get into some of this. Okay, so the suggestions that these therapists had when interviewed was basically like, think about how your hyperindependence has served you. Acknowledge it, honor it, express gratitude for your own bravery and self-sufficiency, right? Like, honor the fact that this is a part of who you are. But also think about areas of your life where it's not working for you. And think about ways that you can let people into your life a little bit more. And so that's sort of like the framework we're going to continue on with here. So let me just pitch this to you, I guess. In what ways do you think that Lorelai's hyper-independence has really helped her?
I think it allowed her to, pardon my language, just have a real swift kick in the ass, once she left home, to realize I'm not going to have maids doing everything for me. I don't have the financial buffer of mom and dad anymore until, later on down the line, she asks for Chilton money and then like rebounds into that. But I think it allowed her to grow up, which is obviously something that she very quickly needed to do when you have a child that you're trying to raise as a 16-year-old. But I think it allowed her to have a little bit of a backbone and realize that I need to sort of fall back on myself, that I need to be a little bit more resilient and garner that sort of independence where I'm not relying on even boyfriends to fill an emotional need, parents to fulfill a sort of physical, parental love sort of need. I need to be okay within myself, loving myself, and finding other outlets to have those needs met that are not as detrimental, but that also can draw within a really substantial amount of just internal motivation and well-being. And Lorelai really needed to learn how to love herself, I think, more than she ever had at that moment in time. So I think that sort of hyper independence, one of the benefits of it was allowing her to grow up, to learn to love herself a little bit more, to be proud of herself and her accomplishments, and reflect that positivity onto her daughter as someone that her daughter could then also look up to and aspire to. And she is now setting a good example for.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it was a big part of what allowed her to have the bravery to run away and to make it work. Because as she says to her mom, like, you strangled me. I had nothing in that house. I had no life. I had no air. And that's not good for her, obviously. That's not good for anyone. And the fact that she recognized how important that psychological need was and did what it took to achieve that, I think that was ultimately a benefit to her. And slowly it allowed her to learn how to draw boundaries with people. Sometimes those boundaries were maybe communicated in a passive aggressive way, like when she hunts her mom down at the hair salon in the second episode, and it's just like, I decide how we live. But sometimes people like Emily need that kind of forceful reminder that, like, hey, I'm a grown-up and I can make my own decisions, and I don't need you doing this for me, and I don't want you to do this for me because I can take care of myself. Along with that, it's just sort of like, I don't know, part of me just has this feeling of like, oh, really, Lorelai? Like, something about it still feels juvenile, I guess. But yeah, I think in general, it allowed her to control her own life. And she really needed that after growing up in an environment where her own interests and her own feelings and beliefs and values were never valued or respected. It was always an emphasis on external appearances and legacy and external achievements. And I feel like we've explored this before, especially in like the gifted students kind of episodes, that those kinds of things are not the end all be all and can be very detrimental to anyone, really. But yeah, okay. Moving on, how did her hyper independence hurt her?
How long do you have?
Well, we've only been going for 42 minutes, so like, go off, girlfriend.
Take Rory out of the equation. The apocalypse could be nigh. And I feel like Lorelai would just be like, I'm going to be fine. I've got this, And then she would just, die because she didn't have it. But case in point, I feel like it could be the worst of end times, and she would just not even ask someone for like a sip of water because it's just seen as like a marked failure in her eyes. And it's not. And it's actually really, I think, a toxic trait of hers that she is so reticent to go to anybody. Again, even her best friend, her husband, her partners, and ask for any sort of assistance whatsoever a large amount of the time. It just shows that you also have no trust whatsoever in some of these people that you claim to be that there's some of the most important people in your life that you should be going to and relying on for that. And individuals like that want to help you. Those are the people that want to be there for you, but you have to allow them that chance and that opportunity. And I feel like we get that so many times as well, where people are wanting to step up and be there for Lorelai, and she just shrugs them off and says, no, I can do it. And that also hurts those relationships as well, because those people then feel like, well, does she not care about our relationship and what I'm offering? Why doesn't she want to open up to me? Why doesn't she want to trust me? It was one of the really big problems that she had with Max. And he has that great line where, he says, one of these days you're going to have to let someone into your life and open up the door for them. And I am just volunteering and willing to be that person. Let me in. And she still can't do it. And I think it's one of the predominant features as to why their relationship failed and never panned out, because her walls are up and she is so guarded. And it's not a bad way to be, but you have to measure how high you raise those walls and know that sometimes just bring them down a little bit for the right people in your life. Again, not even just for romantic partners, but for friends, for siblings, for coworkers. You've got to let people in. Otherwise, you're just doomed to live a life of just isolation, I feel like, and emotional void. And I feel like that's why, again, she was so codependent on Rory, because she placed all of that on her daughter's shoulders and said, I will just get all of it from her. I don't need it from anybody else. And so that's one of the biggest ways it was harmful to her.
Yeah. It definitely felt like Lorelai and Rory against the world. Backing up a little bit. Preach to all of that. But yeah, I think all of that is true. And I will add that, it sort of hardened Lorelai to other people's perspectives. It made it very hard for her to perspective take sometimes. And I feel like this makes me think of Atiska to Tasket when she's having that picnic with Luke. And she's like, I'm flexible. As long as everything is exactly how I want it, I'm totally flexible. And that feels so emblematic of her. Everything is her way. Everyone bends to her will. Rory included. And again, that's self-obliterating others. It creates inflexibility and stubbornness and isolation. She tends to like cloister herself that way. And then I guess another negative that I came up with was, she has a lot to be proud of in her life, but pride has a dark side. And it rears its ugly head so many times in the series when Lorelai won't take help from her family or her friends. Like, again, kind of going back to what you said about, like, even if the apocalypse was here, she wouldn't ask for a slice of bread, She won't take help from her family or friends, even when she really needs it. And when no one would judge her for taking it either. I think she thinks that people would have a lower opinion of her if she did have to like stoop to the level of ever being helped by anyone. And obviously the big example that comes to mind for me that sort of like really grinds my gears is Secrets and Loans. When she won't take a loan from her mother, even though keeping a roof over Rory's head should be a priority. Like, she would do it for her Chilton tuition, but not for an emergency that could cost them thousands of dollars and the long-term security of their shelter. Like, not only would she not accept it, but her complete inability to accept help causes a fight between her and Rory. Like, Rory takes this to Emily and is like, yeah, we could use some help. And Emily is like so ready to kick into generosity mode. And Lorelai's like, hell no, no thanks. It's fine. I've got this. And so it causes a fight with her and Rory. And she can't see, like, I mean, I know we've had this conversation about financial abuse and financial control, and Emily's motivations not always being exactly altruistic. But I still think it was wrong for Lorelai to behave in that sort of like petulant way that she does with this, because she's tried so many other avenues to solve this problem on her own, and she is running out of options, and she still won't accept any help from anyone because she's afraid that it will be something that her mom can leverage over her. And I totally get that. But again, like, this is your home. You're extremely proud of this home. You love this home. You and your daughter live there. You can't sleep at night because you hear the little like termite chewing noises and it's freaking you out to the point where you have to wake Suki up in the middle of the night to be like, can we stay over? I don't think Rory did anything wrong in telling Emily, and yet she got chewed out and ignored when she was just trying to knock some sense into her mother. And then she ends up having to be the one to apologize. It's a nuanced situation because Emily is Emily. Ultimately, I do think that Emily wants more connection and interaction with Lorelai, but she already has them in her life. I don't know that she would have been so insistent upon something else, or like would have held it over Lorelai's head any more than she already was for Chilton. I don't know that it would have piled on and made things exponentially worse for Lorelai. But, Lorelai chafes at any expectation or any request or imposition from her mother because of their past. And it's hard for her to get over this. And the quote that like really gets me from the scene where she kind of confronts Rory about it at the end is like, Rory, have you ever been without food or clothes or books or book covers for that matter or anything else you ever needed? No. And see, the reason for that is me. I have a pretty good track record for keeping you alive. So when I tell you I can handle something, you need to respect that, especially since you have no evidence proving I won't. Understand? And like that, I feel like that, end of episode. That's it. That's all we need. That sentence right there proves this point unto itself. I think we could just stop talking. We won't, but we could. Because it's like, when I tell you I can handle something, you need to respect that. And so it's this need to prove herself, to maintain her own pride, to maintain control over the situation, to solve a problem herself, that causes her to block out everything and everyone and creates unnecessary conflict when her mom just wants to be there for her. I sometimes wonder to what extent Lorelai is exaggerating. I mean, I know like Emily and Richard can be awful, but sometimes I wonder about the financial abuse side of things, how much of that is exaggerated in Lorelai's mind or is more of a fear than a reality.
It definitely,
based on other things that Emily has done.
It definitely is. And I think that going back to what you said, I don't think that Emily would have held, this loan for a termite issue within the house over Lorelai's head any more than what she had already put forth. It's not like, she's going to say, oh, well, now she could have, and maybe this is what Lorelai would have been afraid about, but I don't think it was going to be, well, now I want Friday night dinners and Tuesday night dinners. Now I expect you to be here twice a week, or level on any sort of additional expectations. I think that one that she put into place when she gave Lorelai the money for Chilton was some sort of control, but I think it was just also because she was just so genuinely elated to have her daughter and her granddaughter back into her life actively and weekly again, that I think she wasn't going to necessarily, she could still be Emily Gilmore, it wouldn't have surprised me, but I don't think she was going to push those boundaries any more extensively than they would have been. And I think Lorelai was just incorrectly afraid of that. And we also have to, I think, look at this situationally too, where this is an issue. You have termites within your home. This is affecting your livelihood. This is a very significant health hazard. This wasn't just Lorelai pining over, oh, I want a new pair of Jimmy Choos. And so Rory's just like, can you just help mom out? Because she's like bitching about wanting these new kicks. This is about like, no, our house is being destroyed. And we need a place to live. So you need to swallow your pride, going back to what you said about that being an issue for Lorelai as well, and just go to your mother and say, for the sake of our livelihoods and because we need a roof over our heads, please help us out with this, and just swallow that pill. But she can't do it.
Yeah. And on the point of exaggeration, again, by the end, you figure out that Emily is like, oh, I'm going to be having DIR meetings at the inn from now on. So, but also as part of that back and forth with them at the bank, it was sort of like Lorelai being like, so what's it going to be this time? Like, I think sometimes it's her expectation and her resistance to things that causes Emily to go into fight or flight mode. And again, death grip on control. That, they're sort of like, they're triggering each other here. Whereas like if Lorelai could relax into accepting help ever, maybe it wouldn't be so dramatic. And so again, I'm of two minds about this because I understand how deep and how long that lack of trust goes back. But you're exactly right. The context of the situation is so dire and like so fundamentally, foundationally, pun intended, important for her life with Rory that it's just like, if Rory's future was worth it, so is this. And you have to, again, the other option she had was Luke. And why wouldn't she accept it from Luke? This is someone you trust, or at least you trust more than your mother. For him, like, Why would you think he would hold this over your head? What makes you think that you're not worthy of his help? What makes you think this is a worse idea than, you know, whatever else you've tried? It makes no sense to me that this was like such a big dramatic thing. And then you never hear about it again. We never hear about the DAR meetings. We never hear about Lorelai being like, oh my God, my mother was so annoying today at her DAR lunch. And, you know, it's just completely forgotten. I hate that episode. Just none of it makes sense. It's all bad. And Lorelai is just like next level paranoid. And I think that paranoia causes her to retreat, and that causes Emily to cling tighter. And so it's this push-pull dynamic that they have where it's like, if Lorelai could, I think she realizes this over the years, and this is part of why their relationship improves. When she sinks into it and is just like, okay, I'm going to let this wash over me, and I'm going to try it. I'm going to let it happen. And hopefully it won't be as bad as I think. And it actually starts to open up that conversation between them about these issues, and it gets better.
Mm-hmm. And that's just where communication needs to be at the forefront of anything. But going back to like Luke specifically as an example here too, the man is not, you know, going to have emotional outbursts or, you know, write like poetry or like love letters, so to say. But this is his love language, so to say, in terms of how he shows Lorelai that he cares. He wants to do things for her. He helps Rory move into Yale, loaning the vehicle, helping with mattress removal. From the time she's a kid, you know, having, you know, birthday parties, you know, and surprises set up for her at the diner, just always, you know, wanting to be there for her. Even before it became a romantic partnership, the man was invested in wanting to be there for Lorelai. And if he wants to be there for you, let him, because that's also probably really fulfilling for him as well, whether it is from a romantic partnership in the later seasons or even just from friendship, but like pining for more sort of, you know, stance at the beginning of the show. Let people be there for you because they want to be. Again, not just with Luke, but with Suki, with anybody. If someone wants to be there for you, let them. And that's a lesson that Lorelai needed to learn. And I think that she still has some work to do on. I still don't think she's fully there. I don't know if we'll ever get her to that point, but she just needs to open up more.
Yeah, that kind of makes me think that she has almost a double standard for Suki and Luke, especially. I think she does let Suki, like, Luke just kind of shows up and does stuff for her, whether she likes it or not, you know. He makes her the huppah. He shows up to shovel the walk. He loans her stuff, helps Rory move, as you mentioned. But she has a hard time asking him for stuff, whereas I think she's maybe a little more comfortable asking Suki. She doesn't make big asks, but, you know, it's like, and Suki also reciprocates that, where, you know, Suki trusts Lorelai enough to like go on her first date with Jackson with her and trust her to do any number of things in their relationship. Lorelai definitely has moments where she leans on Suki, but then I think there are also moments where she keeps an amount of distance as well, because she thinks that there are moments where Suki is unreliable, like her flakiness and her tardiness. And especially, again, I was kind of rewatching parts of season 4 earlier and sinking Lorelai's once again when she has to confront her about having to send the sink back to its mother in Canada. Suki's not always there for Lorelai in the way that she could be, and I think that just puts that little bit of reticence in Lorelai with her as well. She's very emotionally open with Suki. She is like her sounding board, as much or similarly to Rory in a lot of ways. But she doesn't always ask Suki for too much. I think it's Luke taking the reins on that makes that happen. Lorelai rarely asks him for things. And yeah, like that into itself is a layer of trauma that she needs to unpack. Like, what about asking for help is so uncomfortable for her, and who can she go to ask small things of to get used to that feeling and to get used to trusting others in that way. It's something she needs to recognize. Yeah. Therapy. Yeah, counterdependents do not like therapy. They are very likely to rebel against the therapist and keep them out. So we'll talk more about that next week too. On the hypocrisy note, we'll get there. But yeah, another thing that I think the hyper independence hurts is like kind of going back to the idea of Lorelai and Marie against the world. It's like Lorelai only thinks of Lorelai or Lorelai and Marie. It's how things will feel for her versus the feelings of others. And we see this both in her relationships with her parents and her relationships with guys, like not telling Emily about her engagement because she's worried about Emily's criticism. Instead of using it for a moment of connection and celebration, she's worried that she will feel diminished by her reaction. And it causes an even bigger wedge between them because it was something, like Emily was hurt by the lack of trust and the lack of candor. And she wants Lorelai to share things with her. That was kind of part of the Friday night dinner thing, was like, not only do you have to come for dinner, but it's like, we want updates on your lives. We want a weekly phone call with updates. We want to know what's going on with you. We want to be an active part of your life. And so when Lorelai keeps this massive piece of information from her, that erodes their trust even further. Not just for Lorelai, but for Emily as well. It's like, Lorelai is only concerned with how she's going to feel when Emily inevitably slights her or humiliates her or belittles her, as opposed to like, hey, I have the opportunity to build a bridge with my mom by sharing a little more of myself than maybe I'm used to. I can strategically use this vulnerability to improve our relationship, but she's always just so focused on herself and how she's going to feel instead. And it obviously creeps into her relationships with guys as well. They always need to put their needs on the back burner for her. Think about Luke buying the Twickham house and Lorelai not wanting to sell, or Christopher trying to get her to move out of her house. Obviously, she has a reason to be proud of it and she loves it. But at some point, you have to compromise and build something together with someone else. And it's something that she wasn't really capable of.
Mm-hmm. But to what extent should we be faulting Lorelai for this? Because obviously this is a result of childhood trauma, and specifically with her not disclosing to Emily about her partners. I mean, she doesn't just do it with Max, she does it with Jason too. And there needs to be that whole build up to her even, revealing that relationship. And before she can even come out with it herself, like, Emily and Richard find out in their own disastrous way. But should we be blaming her for not wanting to trust her parents, specifically them, with personal information, when a lot of what she's known in the past is just judgment about what she does choose to disclose?
I don't want any of this to be judgmental of Lorelai, shall we say. I think that, I want to have this nuanced conversation about this topic, because it's not about whether she's right or wrong for it. The fact of the matter is it's happened, and it's something she has to deal with and contend with going forward. And I think the bottom line with it for her is not letting it hinder herself. And so it's not about being like, you're doing this wrong. You're wrong to feel this way. But rather maybe pointing out areas where Lorelai could, what's the line she uses? I think you could like budge that bottom line of yours. I think Lorelai picked that up from her mom, except her bottom line is just different, right? I think we all have a bottom line. And I think the more constructive part of this conversation is not determining right or wrong, but figuring out areas for growth and reflection where Lorelai could at least be more self-aware of what she's doing and how it might be hurting her in other areas. Because regardless of her relationship with her parents and how she wants to proceed in that relationship, this is affecting her in other areas too. It's affecting her relationships with other people. And she needs to recognize those patterns so that she's able to build functional interdependence and intimacy with her romantic partners.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want more for her because I want her to allow the men to come into her life more easily than what we see for her. You know, Max might not have been endgame, but I think it could have gone on a little bit longer than it did if she had just, like we were alluding to earlier, bring down your walls a little bit, lower the drawbridge gate, let, someone into your life without just making them cross like a minefield of like alligators to try and get to you. I want that growth for her in terms of trusting people a little bit more and not just completely dropping the cloak where anyone can come in and then just hurt her because she was too careless with that. There needs to be a balance there as well. But the biggest lesson that I want Lorelai Gilmore to take away is just that lower the walls, give someone a modicum of trust, see what they do with it. And then if they are there for you and they can back up their words and their actions, continue to let that person come into your life a little bit more and slowly but surely let them be present and there for you as opposed to just no one ever.
I like what you said about wanting more for her. And I think that's where part of this comes from for me too, is like, I think we were all rooting for the Gilmores, we wanted their relationship to repair. And Lorelai shouldn't be the only one doing the work, but she's responsible for herself. She's responsible for her own feelings and her own reactions and how she behaves towards these people. She's not responsible for their crap, their histories, their trained responses and all of that kind of stuff. But she is responsible for how she behaves toward them and around them, right? And so everybody needs to do the work here. But Lorelai can start by self-reflecting and using that self-knowledge as a way to improve these relationships by saying, hey, this is what I've observed and this is how I feel about it. And, I think she gets so close sometimes. I'm thinking of the moment when she approaches Emily after the blow up about the Max engagement. And she goes to her with the veils and is like, I don't know how to tell you things because when I'm happy, I'm afraid that you're going to be judgmental. And if I fail, I'm afraid you're going to be judgmental, So she's expressing that. And there is this nice little moment of connection. And that's a good first step. And unfortunately, Emily doesn't maybe internalize it or carry it as a way to do the work on herself, to be like, okay, I need to learn how to modulate my reactions to Lorelai better. Like we need to communicate more about values and how we're going to engage with each other. And maybe I need to reevaluate my behaviors and my beliefs. Neither of them is really doing anything more than the superficial work to not blow up at each other more often. But I think it's a lot deeper and there's more that needs to be expressed and more that needs to be expected out of each other for the relationship to truly heal and move forward. And that's why we have such a back and forth roller coaster of a show, right? Obviously the writers don't want to solve these conflicts because then where are they going to mine that drama from for 7 seasons? And so, the worst character you can have is a self-reflective one, at least in their minds. And so, again, I think very superficial progress is made piecemeal across the seasons as they all kind of work through their stuff and they they have to reckon with the fact that it's like, okay, either I change my behavior or I lose this family member that I love. And so it just becomes, you know, a challenge for everyone involved to do that work, because yeah, when you're as messed up of a family as the Gilmores, that's going to take years in therapy unpacking that. So Lorelai can't be the only one doing this work, but she does need to recognize how it impacts her and how it spills into other domains of her life, work, and relationships with men. Because, oh boy, like, and again, going back to Luke, and we'll probably get more into this too when we talk about their relationship, but it's part of why he works for her, because he doesn't push her to open up. He's not a very open guy. He demands honesty from her, but he never encourages her to go deeper or interrogate any of her hesitations. And that's more comfortable for her than doing the work like she had to do with Max and Chris.
Yeah. But does it make Luke still the right person for her at the end of the day?
I have mixed feelings on that. I love Luke, and I can see kind of why they work, because he's one of the people she can most securely attach to, which is in general a good thing. But I still think their dynamic is a little troubling, and we will definitely, I think it's going to be at least a 2-parter on Lorelai and Luke's relationship and friendship. I feel like I need a little bit more time to like fully like work out all of my thoughts on them. And, you know, that's one of my scripts that's a little less developed at this point. But like, I have some problems with their relationship because it is very avoidant, and they are very much like two independent people who just happen to cohabitate. And even, you know, something that's interesting is Emily is very observant of Lorelai. She very much kind of has a finger on the pulse with her, where she calls her out on her bullshit, but Lorelai is so defensive about that she's not able to hear it and take it in. And she says it when they're in therapy in the revival, you're roommates. He's your bosom buddy. You know, Emily is the one who's pointing out, hey, you have trouble trusting and committing and being integrated with another human being. Because, like, her example of life and love was her parents, where her mother was totally subservient to her father in a lot of ways. And she never wanted to be that reliant on another person. And so she, again, always has that wall up. Like, going back to our castle metaphor, I'm imagining Lorelai's like Winterfell. You got that like 80-foot castle wall with like, isn't it like a double wall, and there's a moat and all the alligators? That's not canon, but now I'm imagining the minefield of alligators as well. I'm just, you know, it's a thing. Or, you know, some sort of standing army waiting to go off to war, just hanging out outside of Winterfell. You got to get through all that to like get to Lorelai. And then there's like archers on the wall and shit too. But yeah, it's an excellent metaphor for her emotional invulnerability. And yeah, it's Emily, for all of her faults, often calls Lorelai out on her crap, and is just like, hey, one of my favorites, going to her, like, just one of the first things we hear about in terms of Lorelai's personality and like what drives her in the pilot is their conversation in the kitchen. You know, I did it on my own with no help from anyone. And Emily's like, think of where you'd be if you'd had a little help, and where Rory would be. And that, I think, really gets to the heart of this hyper independence, is that, again, we're social creatures. We have social needs. And no one person is an island. We saw what happened when Paris tried to be an island. She sunk the Yale Daily News. And I think, oh, wow, that might have to be an area we explore later too, is Paris's hyper independence. But you can't do everything by yourself. No person has all of the resources and all of the expertise and all of the experiences to get through life in a complex modern world, right? Maybe we could have when we were still hunter-gatherers and life was simple and we only had like a small clan of people to worry about, but things are so much more different, or things are so much more complicated now. Things are different. And Lorelai is so smart and so capable, so competent. What would her life have been like if she had let people in? If she had leaned on people a little more and gotten support? What could she have been capable of? What could she have achieved or achieved faster or more efficiently with less strife if she had just, again, the Christopher stuff. We'll get more into this when we talk about Chris as a dad, but like, what would her life have been like? And what would Rory's life have been like if Lorelai could trust that Chris meant what he said when he said, I'll move in here, I'll raise the baby with you. I'm not going to go off to Europe. I'm not going to go off to school. I have to get a job and I have to be here for you. Like, what if she had just trusted him? She had so much distrust of her parents and their plans for her life that she just completely shut out the idea. She completely shut Chris out. But what would everyone's life have been like if she had support? Like, she could have gone to college sooner. Maybe she could have opened an inn sooner or a different kind of business. She could have had a very different life. And even if her parents weren't supporting her forever, a little bit of extended support or a 2-income household or something like that could have provided so much more stability and taken so much stress and struggle off of their plates.
Yeah. I mean, and again, we've talked about this before, but the living conditions that Rory had to grow up in, like, it would not have surprised me if child services had been contacted at some point because Rory was receiving inadequate care in line with what the state of Connecticut would probably deem to be fit and reasonable for a child in her position. So it would have also probably bettered Rory's childhood as well. And if you're so concerned about wanting to be there for your kid, which you always claim to be, and this is the one person that you rely on and trust more than anybody else, and that you love in the world more than anybody else, why not make those sacrifices, not even for yourself, but for the sake of your kid? And again, just humble yourself a little bit, swallow that pride, and realize that it is not about you. It is about Rory more so. And it goes back to what you said too. She is the only person that Lorelai would say, it's not about me anymore, for I will put my needs for Rory first and foremost, but your actions don't always back that up. And so that's, I mean, we can talk about more, too, when, in the hypocrisy episode, but that's hypocritical to claim that you have so much care and love for your child and that you're going to put them first, but then you make choices that actually put yourself first even more than your own kid.
Yeah, that makes me think of the third Lorelai when Trix offers the trust fund, and Lorelai gets all like nervous about it and loses out on $250,000 apparently for Rory and her. Like, think of what that could have done for the comfort of their lives and Lorelai's possibility for opening a business and stuff. Like, yeah, we're gonna have to talk about that at some point because I am so confused as to why Lorelai hates trust fund kids and hates wealth and hates I was watching Scene in a Mall earlier when Emily buys them all that stuff, and then they go to the diner and are opening it all up, and she's like, it's the meaningless crap of the rich who just like buy whatever they want. That sort of attitude that she has towards the rich. But she's so willing, initially at least, to accept that trust fund, and it's just like, I thought you were like morally opposed to this, and like you don't want help from anyone, but you're willing to let your daughter accept a trust fund. Maybe we'll have to bring that back up in hypocrisy as well, because yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's a situation, and it's not the only one, where Lorelai makes someone else's decisions for them because of her own insecurities and her own fears.
Yep. Not only with her daughter, with even, like, again, Suki as a best friend, with her romantic partners. She makes it largely about what she wants, but also what she feels is best for everybody else that's involved in her life. And it's very self-centered, and she doesn't really factor anyone else in the way that she should. And I think that's also why, I mean, I've said this before, but like, is Lorelai Gilmore even deserving of a man? Like, I would make the argument that, like, no, not unless we see some drastic change and growth in her, because she is just way too self-absorbed sometimes. And I just echo what you said. She makes choices for people based on what she thinks is good without factoring in what is good for that other individual. And that can really be damaging as well. And I think we do see that play out sometimes.
Yeah. I feel like you just said something about survival, and that triggered another thought. Am I wrong? Am I like nuts, or am I just making this up? Anyway.
No, you're good.
Cannot brain today. Has the dumb. Yeah. Often when people are hyper independent, they only know themselves at the survival level. Like, they do what it takes to survive. They do what it takes to, like, preserve their ego, essentially. Like, not their sense of grandiosity ego, but their, like, id ego, super ego. They don't go any deeper than that because they live in a prolonged state of survival mode, basically, where they're like, I just have to do what it takes to get through this. And they live like that for so long that they forget that there are other options, that there are other networks of support that they could tap into, that there are wells of love and generosity, and that people want to share information and resources and emotions with people. And so it's hard for Lorelai to go deeper and to emotionally regulate on that level, and to realize these things, and to tap into people who are better emotionally regulated than her, because again, she did what it took to survive for both her and Marie for so long that now I think this is what we're seeing in the show. We obviously didn't get the early years, but we're seeing this, the effects of 16 years of putting yourself on the back burner and living in survival mode, and not stopping long enough to do any of that work, to be like, why do I behave the way I do? What is it like? And again, superficiality. It's just, my parents suck, and all I have to do is keep them out of my lives and everything will be okay. And she doesn't go any further in her analysis than that. It's just a hard boundary and an isolation. And she just sort of like leans into something that's more comfortable. And it could be part of the reason that she stays in that place for so long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's also something to be said for the fact that if you allow people to help you, it then in turn just allows you to pay it forward even more. And not that Lorelai Gilmore was ever unwilling to help others. She definitely is a very caring and compassionate individual. You know, she's there for the people in her life as best as she can be in any given moment. But I feel like she was also sometimes not always maybe the best friend to people that she could have been, not always the best partner. And I feel like if she lets people help her, she then in turn will be more beneficial as someone who is willing to assist others and just pass it along in that way. But when you don't have any sort of good model for that, and you're so closed off, it just then disallows her to, I think, have been maybe a better human being that she possibly could have been in terms of supporting the people that she cares most about as well and being there for them.
Yeah. She could have taken a lot off of her plate by lightening her load and relying on other people. She could have learned more and tapped into other sources of knowledge. She could have been more collaborative with people. You know, maybe an active invitation for Chris to be part of Rory's life, as opposed to just, oh, the door's open, instead of like, hey, I have this parenting conundrum. What do you think? Like, what would you do? And testing the waters with co-parenting in that way. Again, it was just all like, I'm doing it on my own. I'm making all of the calls, whether you like it or not. I'm going to steamroll you here. You know, she could have improved a lot of relationships by fostering that sense of reciprocity and equality, equanimity with other people. And yeah, you're right. It would have fed into her being a better mom, a better friend, a better partner by dropping those defenses. Drain them out, open the door, lower the drawbridge, right? Call off the alligators, okay? Let them go home to Florida.
I mean, I will say, like Lorelai on your drawbridge. If you see that it's Max Medina who's just trying to get into the castle, let the man in. Now if you see that it's Francie Jarvis, maybe ask some questions first. I don't know. You get what I'm saying? Like, be mindful of whom you're letting in, but when it's someone in your life who is so present and there for you and has a proven track record of being successful in that regard, lower the bridge. If you have to ask some questions first of anyone who's trying to gain access, ask those questions, but don't be immediately dismissive. And that's where I think Lorelai, again, just needed some serious growth, where she was just, I could see her again standing up there with Rory, and Rory might even be holding like a bow and arrow next to her and just saying like, no one's ever coming in here ever. And Lorelai Gilmore just needed to, like, I'm just going to go back to what you said because I think that's a perfect metaphor and way to put it. Drain the moat, call off the alligators, let my love open the door.
Yeah, all that's playing in my head right now is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's like Lorelai is John Cleese's character standing up on top of the walls being like, your father was a hamster and your mother smells like elderberries, or whatever that quote is. Like, just, mumbling nonsense and just being very resistant. And yeah, just using comedy as a defense. It's almost like it's a metaphor or something.
We never did that.
I know, right? Oh my god. 'Tis but a flesh wound. Oh god. Yeah. So yeah. And now I'm seeing Max as like a knight in shining armor outside of the castle. And he very well could be that for someone, but he couldn't be that for Lorelai because, he was ready for the kind of relationship that she wasn't. And so, they were both sort of negotiating their boundaries and couldn't come to an agreement on what needs and expectations could and would be met by the other. And, it's unfortunate, but hopefully Max is living his best life out there. Anyway, I feel like we should start wrapping this up. I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. So, like, we're not here today to talk about Rory, but I would be remiss if I didn't point out that this complex was passed on to her as well. I think we can see it in her deep introversion. I mean, part of that is sort of ingrained personality, but part of it is Lorelai's insistence on do whatever you want as long as it doesn't hurt someone else, right? Mm-hmm. And it gives Rory the license to be cut off and live in her inner world instead of engaging as much with the outer world. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing, but I think it just is sort of interesting to know. And then we see it in her lack of desire to join clubs and to be social, to put herself out there, make herself vulnerable, like when she wants Dean to go with her to the dance and Lorelai has to sort of like talk her up about it. We see her having attachment issues with men herself. And ultimately, the way that the series ends with her turning down Logan's proposal. And we see that Rory needs and has a lot of help to do what she does and to get to where she is. She's not as independent as she thinks, nor maybe even as independent as Lorelai is. And I think it goes to show that she's really following in her mother's footsteps of touting her independence rather than having it, because independence is the main ideal that they seem to uphold without recognition that it's not the end all be all of a happy, fulfilled life. In itself, independence is not enough for fulfillment because it can be a lonely existence to never commit to another person, to never trust another person, to never build anything with another person, whether it's a business or a marriage or a family. Like, not everybody needs to have like a till death do us part kind of marriage to be fulfilled in relationships. There can be any number of ways you can have your particular needs met. And as long as you're feeling happy and fulfilled, that's important. But I think what they've done is they've put so much emphasis on independence and maybe not enough on autonomy, because there is a difference. There's a difference between independence and isolation, and independence and self-sufficiency, and independence and autonomy. Because autonomy is, a feeling of control over your own life and your own actions. It's pursuing what's going to make you happy, like the freedom to be able to do that. Independence is a part of that. You have to have, a sense of self. You need to have an identity that is comfortable and confident and regulated, to feel confident going out to pursue what you want, to go after your dreams, essentially. But autonomy does not discount the role that others play in your life the way independence, and especially this extreme toxic form of independence, can do. It doesn't say anything about never receive help from others, only rely on yourself. It just, encourages us to be like, to pursue our own identity, to find out what that is, to determine that for ourselves, to just determine the course of our own lives. That is the core of autonomy. We all need that. It is a core feature of the human existence to want and need that. And Lorelai didn't get that as a kid. And the compensatory mechanism was extreme independence. And so I think Rory picked it up from her mom being like, the best way to be is independent and strong and doing it for myself, kind of thing. I don't need a man. I don't want a man. I don't want to be that girl, etc., etc. And so we'll have to deconstruct that sometime, because, whoo boy. Mm-hmm. But I think it's really important to draw the distinction between those concepts. And like, autonomy is very important to living a happy life, but connection with others is another side of that equation, right? We have to have this balance of both, where we can live life on our own terms while also having our social needs met and feeling connected to others, because there's just so much joy in that.
Yeah, and both can coexist. And that's what Lorelai and Rory never understood. And they still don't understand as of the revival. They still have so much work to do there. But you can be yourself and live your best life, and you do you, but still let other people come in and be a part of it too, without diminishing who you are or your sense of self. Those people can add to your life in remarkable, remarkable ways. Let them in, work on finding that balance, because like you said, autonomy and independence are two entirely different concepts. They need to learn it, and they need to let those people come into their life, because they will add value. They will not be a diminishment. They will be just a positive light. And it's a pro on your list, Rory. It's not a con. Put it there.
Yes. Independence is good, but independence over all else can be bad. Like any other good thing, too much can have bad consequences downstream. It can lead to a lot of psychological distress and isolation, loneliness, depression, anxiety, lack of resources. And, if we can't let people in and we can't embrace change and trust and vulnerability, that's when we're lost as a person, and the show kind of vaunts independence as the sort of like, third wave feminism kind of like ideal of the strong girl boss, without maybe, and maybe they do. Maybe I'm just sort of like forgetting maybe some minutia, or maybe they're doing it as an exercise in trying to demonstrate it by showing instead of telling. But yeah, they never really interrogate it or cause the characters to recognize, truly recognize how this extreme need for independence is holding them back in unexpected ways.
Yep. Life lessons for our Gilmore Girls women to learn.
Yep.
But also therapy. Therapy and life lessons.
Yep. I think the theme of our podcast is the Gilmore Girls need therapy. I feel like at this stage, I just need to go back to school and get like another bachelor's in psychology and probably some sort of like literature or cultural criticism field too, because I'm just like, I'm so in this now that I feel like I need the credentials to back up the therapy I try to give these fictional characters. Obviously, as we said up front, not a mental health professional, just someone who is really interested in these things and has been for years and has been trying to work on myself and improve myself in this process. And doing that work for myself makes it even more frustrating to see Lorelai and Murray not doing it, because I know how much I've grown in the last 10 years or whatever, and how many great revelations I've had about myself, and how the formation of secure relationships feels so much different to those insecure ones that I had in my early 20s. And having someone you can rely on and having that kind of trust, it just brings such a sense of calm. And Rory and Lorelai are both so resistant to that. They're just like, nope, gonna do it on my own, don't need you, bye. Whereas like I think there's a place you can get to where you're just like, I've been okay on my own for years, but wouldn't it be nice?
Yeah, and it just goes back to, I think, what we said is we just want more for our Gilmore Girls women. And this is how we want more for them. This is what it is.
Yeah. Well, I think that wraps us up for this one.
Yeah. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If you have any thoughts, and we hope that you do, because there's so much to be said about Lorelai Gilmore and her independent nature and, what we've discussed, please drop us a comment and let us know. We're so intrigued to hear what you have to say as well. And we'd love to just, hear your thoughts and hear what you have to say.
Yeah. And on that note, don't forget, if you haven't already, on your way out the door, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. It helps us out. Really, really does. We're very appreciative of it. We want to hear from you if you like this or not. We want your opinions. Go to the links below. We also have links to social media where you can find us, our email if you want to shoot us up an email there. We have links to our lovely friend Jess's Gilmore Girls merch. Themed merch. No trademark disputes here. And also to the FanFest website and page, because that's coming up in October. We're creeping closer. It's only March, but we're getting there. We're so close. So excited to go back to New England. This time it's going to be in Guildford, Connecticut from October 18th to 20th. They've already announced several names of guests, so go check out their social media and their website to see who's coming. They're announcing new guests every Friday for the time being, so keep your eyes peeled for more announcements. Make sure you go get your tickets before they're gone, and we hope to see you there.
Yeah, we're so excited about that, and it is a wonderful event that we will talk up every single week until it actually rolls around. So just check that out. And again, just any support that we get, is always appreciated. We hope you'd enjoyed this episode, and just leave us your comments and your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you have to say. But other than that, I think we'll close this one out, and we hope that we will see you next Friday night for dinner.
Bye.
Take care.